Right now, if you reach into your pocket, you might pull out a piece of paper or a little metal disc. Or maybe you just have a piece of plastic that connects to a server somewhere. We all agree that these things have value. But for most of human history, the most powerful currency on Earth wasn't paper, metal, or plastic. It was a tiny dead sea snail. And when European merchants figured out how to exploit that snail, they triggered one of the most devastating financial collapses the world has ever seen. This is a cowrie shell, specifically Monetaria moneta. It's about the size of a thumb, shiny, yellowish white, and it looks a little bit like a tiny porcelain coffee bean. Today you can buy a bag of them for a few dollars at a craft store. You might see them braided into hair or glued onto a cheap necklace. But for over 1,000 years, this exact shell was the undisputed king of global finance. It was the reserve currency of the ancient world. To understand why a sea snail became money, you have to understand what makes money good. Good money needs to be durable. You can drop a cowrie shell, step on it, or leave it in the rain, and it won't break or rust. Good money needs to be portable. You can easily scoop up 100 cowries in one hand. Good money needs to be divisible. You can trade one shell for a piece of fruit or 1,000,000 shells for a house. But most importantly, good money needs to be impossible to fake. You can't counterfeit a cowrie shell. Think about how hard it is to make fake money today. Governments use special paper, color-shifting ink, and complex microprinting. Nature did all of that for the cowrie shell automatically. The shell is created by a living biological creature that carefully deposits layers of calcium carbonate over its lifetime. This creates a smooth, glossy enamel finish and a complex, jagged opening that is biologically unique. If you lived in the year 1200, you couldn't fake this. You couldn't carve a piece of bone or mold a piece of clay to perfectly match a real shell. Even if you tried, everyone would immediately spot the fake just by running their thumb over it. Nature did the minting for you, and nature's anti-counterfeit technology was flawless. Because of these perfect properties, the cowrie shell took over the world. By the 1300s, cowries were being used as money in China, India, the Middle East, and all across the vast continent of Africa. In fact, the cowrie was so respected in China that the classical Chinese character for money is literally a drawing of a cowrie shell. Many of the great wealthy empires of West Africa, like the Mali Empire and the Kingdom of Dahomey, ran entirely on a cowrie economy. Taxes were paid in shells. Armies were funded with shells. Merchants grew fabulously wealthy, hoarding massive vaults of shells. But there was a catch, and this catch is the absolute secret to all good money. To be valuable, money has to be scarce. If everyone can just pick money up off the ground, it becomes worthless instantly. And the West African empires didn't have any cowrie shells on their own beaches. The water in the Atlantic Ocean is too cold for Monetaria moneta to survive. Almost all of the world's currency-grade cowrie shells came from exactly one place on Earth, a tiny chain of islands in the Indian Ocean called the Maldives. For centuries, this massive geographical distance created a perfectly balanced financial system. Arab merchants would sail to the Maldives, harvest the shells from the reefs, and bring them back to the Middle East. From there, the shells were slowly, painstakingly carried across the brutal Sahara Desert by nomadic camel caravans. This was incredibly dangerous work. By the time a single shell survived the desert and reached a market in West Africa, it had traveled over 4,000 miles. That long, terrifying journey kept the supply of shells artificially low. It was the medieval equivalent of mining Bitcoin. The sheer physical effort required to transport the shells meant the market could never be unexpectedly flooded. The value of the cowrie was completely stable for centuries, until the Europeans arrived. In the 1500s, European explorers, first the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and finally the British, started sailing down the coast of West Africa. They wanted to trade. They wanted gold, ivory, palm oil, and tragically, they wanted enslaved human beings. The Europeans showed up with ships full of silver and gold coins, expecting the Africans to be dazzled. But the wealthy West African kings looked at the European coins and laughed. They didn't want heavy, useless metal discs. They didn't trust European paper or foreign gold. They wanted real money. They demanded to be paid in cowrie shells. At first, the Europeans were confused. To a merchant from London or Amsterdam, a sea snail shell was basically beach trash. It had absolutely no value in Europe. But then, the European merchants realized something terrifyingly powerful. They possessed a piece of technology the Africans didn't have. Massive, deep-water, ocean-faring galleons. The Europeans didn't have to rely on slow, dangerous camel caravans across the Sahara Desert. They could just sail entirely around the bottom of Africa, straight across the ocean to the Maldives. And that completely shattered the containment barrier that kept the money stable. A single exhausted camel could only carry a few dozen pounds of shells across the hot sand. But a single European galleon could effortlessly carry 40 tons of shells across the open water. The physical cost of mining the money had just been completely erased. And that is exactly what they did. European trade companies like the famous Dutch East India Company began sending massive fleets directly to the source. They arrived in the Maldives and found billions of cowrie shells sitting in the shallow water, practically free for the taking. The Europeans started buying shells by the ton. They bought so many shells that they actually used them as ballast. They poured literal tons of cowries into the deep, dark bottoms of their wooden ships, just to weigh the ships down and keep them balanced in the rough ocean. Then they turned around and sailed back to West Africa. Imagine you are a merchant in the kingdom of Dahomey in the year 1700. You have spent your entire life working hard, saving your money and building a massive fortune. Your wealth is stored in a giant, heavily guarded vault, filled with millions of precious cowrie shells. Then, one morning, a single British ship docks at the port. The captain opens the hull and shovels out 40 million cowrie shells in a single afternoon, and he uses that free money to buy up the real physical resources of your country. At first, to the average person on the street, it seemed like an economic boom. Suddenly there was more money flowing through West Africa than ever before. But then the brutal reality of basic economics took over. When a European ship dumped 40 million shells into a city, the value of a single shell dropped. So, to buy the same amount of grain, a local farmer had to charge twice as many shells just to survive. Then, the next year, 3 more European ships arrived, dumping 100 million shells. Prices doubled again. Then they doubled again. The Europeans had discovered the ultimate financial cheat code. They were essentially printing the African reserve currency for free. They were swapping literal beach shells for actual physical wealth and human labor, and it caused one of the worst, most devastating cases of hyperinflation in human history. We actually have the historical receipts to prove exactly how bad it got. In the coastal trading city of Ouidah in the year 1724, the price of purchasing an enslaved person was about 8,000 cowrie shells. By the year 1773, just 50 years later, that exact same price had skyrocketed to 192,000 cowries. That is a 2,400% inflation rate in a single generation. The money wasn't just losing value, it was becoming completely worthless. Things got so ridiculous that the physical weight of the money became a massive problem. In the old days, a wealthy man could carry a small pouch of cowries to the market to buy a cow. By the mid-1800s, hyperinflation was so severe that buying a single cow required millions of shells. You couldn't carry that in a pouch. You needed a team of strong laborers just to carry the money to the market. Sometimes the cost of paying the laborers to carry the shells was actually higher than the value of the shells they were carrying. The entire system was eating itself alive. The economies of massive, centuries-old African empires began to buckle and collapse. Life savings evaporated into thin air. The financial stability that had lasted for 1,000 years was destroyed in just a few decades. And it wasn't destroyed by a conquering army, or a plague, or a natural disaster. It was destroyed by inflation. It was destroyed because a technologically advanced group of foreigners figured out how to flood the market with fake wealth. By the late 19th century, the Cowrie system was completely broken, but the European colonial powers wanted to make sure it was dead forever. They officially stepped in and banned the shell, but they did something incredibly sinister to force the transition. They imposed what was called a hut tax. Every African citizen suddenly had to pay a yearly tax to the colonial government just for living in their own house. But the government refused to accept cowrie shells as payment. They only accepted European coins, like the French franc or the British shilling. If you wanted to pay your taxes and avoid going to prison, you had to get European coins. And the only way to get European coins was to abandon your own failing businesses and go work for the Europeans at a wage they decided. The transition was brutal, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. Overnight, millions of West Africans who held their life savings in cowrie shells were told that their money was legally worthless. Mountains of shells were literally left to rot in the sun outside abandoned marketplaces. The greatest, most stable currency in human history was reduced to literal garbage on the street. There is a very dark, very modern lesson buried in the story of the cowrie shell. We like to think that money has intrinsic value. We like to think a dollar is a dollar, and it will always be a dollar. But the truth is, the value of your money relies entirely on the fact that it is hard to get. The moment somebody figures out how to get it easily, you lose everything. When the Europeans sailed to the Maldives and loaded their ships with shells, they weren't creating new wealth. They were simply stealing the purchasing power from the people who already held the shells. This is exactly what happens when a modern central bank decides to print $1 trillion new dollars out of thin air. They aren't creating new wealth. They are just secretly draining the value out of the dollars sitting in your savings account. The cowrie shell crisis is the exact reason why modern digital currencies like Bitcoin were invented. Bitcoin is designed with a hard, unchangeable mathematical cap. There will never be more than 21 million of them. No matter how advanced our computers get, no matter how big our ships get, nobody can ever sail to a digital island and flood the market with free Bitcoin. It is an attempt to build a cowrie shell that the Europeans can't counterfeit. The story of the cowrie shell isn't just a weird historical footnote about sea snails. It's a warning. It is a warning that any currency, no matter how trusted, no matter how ancient, can be destroyed if the people in charge of the supply decide to turn on the printers. The West African empires learned that lesson the hard way. They watched their entire civilization crumble under the weight of billions of shiny little shells. And if we aren't careful with the money we use today, we might just end up drowning in our own modern version of the cowrie shell.